Hey y'all, it's Mr. Delata again with the World History AP discussion on society and the industrial age and some of the consequences of industrialization on families and the working class and the different class developments that we were just talking about in class. So here we go. So one of the last things we were just talking about was like the living conditions for poor people in the urban cities, the ones that are actually doing the factory work and everything. And remember, because factory wages, at least initially, are so low, people can't really afford quality housing, right? And again, this is something that you've covered in American history, but basically, in the cities, factory workers tend to be crowded into tenements, right? The low-income, really low-quality housing, which is essentially tiny little apartments. Okay, tenement buildings, like the ones you see in places like New York City, they're basically the size of apartment buildings today, but we're talking about, maybe a few feet across and, crammed in entire families into these tiny buildings where you probably don't even have enough room for everybody to sleep in a bed. Bunk beds get really common. Kitchens are tiny, right? If they exist at all. There's no bathroom in these places. If you're lucky and you live in a nice tenement, there might be a bathroom at the end of the hallway that something like a dozen or maybe even 20 or 30 families all share. More likely, there's going to be an outhouse outside where you might even have a couple hundred families all sharing one outhouse. Conditions are really, really bad. And because all these people are crammed into such a small, confined space, both with each other and their family and with so many other people, and they're sharing the toilets and everything, of course, disease spreads really rampantly, especially diseases brought by contaminated water, especially cholera, which is essentially a disease that, because the water is tainted and been in contact with essentially human waste, your body shuts down because even though you're drinking water, since it's contaminated, you basically die of dehydration from vomiting, diarrhea, that sort of stuff. And one of the changes we see in the Industrial Revolution is that eventually people get tired of this and they figure out how to stop contaminated water and all this sickness from spreading. So, for example, germ theory starts to come out, which leads to water sanitation programs by these cities, as well as better sewer systems to carry the wastewater away. And that's just like some of the other problems with industrialization that start to get fixed, right? Like high crime leads to official public police departments, right? Problems with trash piling up leads to public sanitation departments that deal with the water and that have people whose job it is to carry away all the trash, right? And then, fire departments that deal with, fire. But the end result is, even though there is a significant amount of poverty and some suffering for the urban working class, when it's all said and done, like we've talked about, the standard of living goes up pretty much everywhere and for everybody because of the Industrial Revolution, where even the poor people have a better standard of living than poor people in the lower classes that had come before them, right? And I think I said this in class, but imagine the poorest people in, say, the United States today versus the poorest people in the United States in, say, the 1940s or the 1890s, right? It's not always sunshine and rainbows, but standard of living does go up. And since we're bringing up class, let's go ahead and talk about the three new classes that kind of evolve because of industrialization. So we still have people at the top, people at the bottom, right? And the rich people in the Industrial Revolution, like the Andrew Carnegies, Rockefellers, Krupps of the world, they're getting exorbitantly rich, but not everybody's living it up. We still have a lower class. This time it's factory workers. The big difference here is the rise of the middle class. Because of industrial production, because of consumer goods and more capital and everything, there's a much, much higher number of people who have some property and who have a pretty good quality of life and can afford to buy most things that they want, and especially everything that they need, right? And now, most people are in the middle class, and that starts in the 1800s because of the Industrial Revolution. Okay? And then the split between rich and poor is also different because, again, instead of the lords and the nobles being at the top and only having a handful of people, and then a vast majority of people being, say, poor peasants, now there's a few very rich industrialists, and there's a few pretty poor factory workers, but then there's a lot more people in the middle that have it a lot better. And like I said, even the poorest people do see a rise in their standard of living. Now, if you're wondering what kind of jobs these people do, the rich people are going to be, the factory owners and stuff like that. Poor people are going to be factory workers and just, some farmers and things. But that's something that's on the downward trend because of urbanization. The middle class is what all these new jobs are, right? This is going to be the white collar jobs, people who dress up in a suit essentially to go work in an office all day. Okay, just because you work in an office doesn't mean you're rich, but you're probably going to be making a little bit more money than somebody who's unskilled labor in a factory, right? Because factory workers, all they have to do is plug in, an interchangeable part into the same thing over and over again, push the same button. So their wages are incredibly low, the conditions are bad. White collar middle class workers usually have to have at least some sort of training, at least some sort of education. They got to at least be able to read, which means they get paid more, they have a higher quality job that they're doing, and so they get higher pay. And this is, middle class professionals like doctors, lawyers, teachers, overseers and factory foremen and stuff like that are telling everybody else what to do. That's going to be the middle class most of the time. Now, what I mentioned a second ago about unskilled labor in the factories, this is something we see skyrocket during the 1800s because, again, you don't really need to know anything in order to put something together in a factory or push a button in a factory, right? You need skilled workers to build and maintain the machines, sure, but anybody, regardless of intelligence, regardless of education, can work in a factory and pull a lever, right? And because of that, these workers are extremely expendable, which is why when you see strikes, you just see people get replaced by scabs. And that's also why wages stay so low. And David Ricardo comes up with this concept called the iron law of wages, where essentially he explains that wages will always be as low as possible. Now, that's not necessarily true because, when we see reform movements and things, they get to, minimum wage laws, and the market does regulate itself a little bit in that people don't want to go work for somewhere that's not going to pay you well. The only problem is if you're an unskilled worker, you end up not having very many options, and you have to work somewhere that has either very, very low pay before minimum wage or right above it maybe later on. One more quick distinction we need to be able to make too, and again, you should remember this, but it's the difference between captains of industry and robber barons. Essentially, these are terms that are both applied to the same people, right? Any rich industrialist. And if you disagree with their practices, you usually refer to them as robber barons, people who exploited the workers. This is going to be, more on the Rockefeller side, where you're very predatory with your business practices. You don't give your workers a lot of benefits or anything like that. You have low wages. Whereas the captains of industry are recognized for creating jobs, people like Carnegie that take care of their workers, that give back to the community. But remember, literally all of these industrialists are doing some good and some bad. It's just, even people like Carnegie, who gave all of his fortune away, he still has things like the Homestead strike going on. And people like Rockefeller, who are considered to be essentially the devil by some people because of their, hellacious working conditions and buying out all the competition and forming a monopoly on purpose. Rockefeller dropped $500 million to cure yellow fever, right? I mean, there's some good and some bad with all of these industrialists. Now, another change, because remember we're showing continuity and change as part of our overarching thing that we need to be able to analyze here, is the difference between farm work versus factory work, right? As all these people during the Industrial Revolution are going into the cities with urbanization, they're living an entirely different style of life because they're doing such a different type of work, right? Before industrialization, parents and kids, like the whole family, they would live in the house together all day, and they would be in close proximity with each other all the time. Even if they were working, they were all working together on, say, the family farm. But with factory work, that changes. Industrialization breaks up those families because industrial machinery means you can't do the work at home. You have to go to the factory, and especially once we get child labor laws passed, that means that the parents are at work and the kids are not, right? For the most part, that means that kids end up going to school, but that still means that they're separate. And that means that kids develop differently after industrialization because they don't have the constant parental influence. As far as the workers themselves, factory work tends to be a lot more demanding than farm work. Not that farm work is easy, but in a factory, you don't decide your own hours like a farmer would, right? You have the boss tell you when to show up and when you're allowed to leave and when you're allowed to take breaks, right? That leads to what's called the tyranny of the clock, where you have to clock in and clock out, usually at the same time every day. Long hours, you're not allowed to stop because These hours are much stricter than, say, someone who's working on their own farm. When you work is not based on when you need to work, it's based on when the boss wants you to work. Right? And on top of that, factory work is way more dangerous than farm work because, there's all these machines that can kill you with almost no safety regulations early on. And then when you consider that they're doing these very repetitive, mind-numbing tasks for 12 to 16 hours a day, you get mental and physical exhaustion that both make it more likely that you get hurt on the job. And like we've already talked about, there is no such thing as workers' compensation or anything, at least early on, where if you get hurt, it shows that you're careless. And so best case scenario, you get fired with a couple of missing fingers or a missing hand. Worst case scenario, you die. And there's no compensation to the family either in that case, at least before reform movements. Now, shifting back to kids and the effects on them real quick. With child labor, right, it's necessary for a lot of these urban families because the wages in the factories are so low, they need every possible amount of income coming into the family to put food on the table. So if you've got kids, they have to work. And so child labor as low as 4 and 5 years old was pretty common in most industrialized societies in the 1800s, before child labor reform anyway. And kids were actually really prized by some factory workers and textile mills and mines because kids are small, right? Kids are nimble, they can get into tight spaces in mines in between the factory machinery. They have small hands that can reach inside machinery parts to pull out the gunk if somebody falls into the machine. But all the problems with factories that adults have to deal with are even worse for kids because, kids get bored easily, and so they stop paying attention sometimes. They fall into the machines a little bit more, and all the problems with ventilation and breathing in, coal dust in the mines, breathing in fabric fibers in the textile mills, that takes a toll on an adult who's only breathing it in for, say, the last few decades of their life before it kills them. Kids that start breathing in these fumes and other things when they're 5, that means that those health problems are going to develop even quicker, and those kids are going to have a much shorter lifespan as a result. And remember, too, that the mines are particularly bad because, they're really, really hot. We're talking well over 100 degrees. They have these back-breaking tasks that they have to do all day. And then there's cave-ins, explosions, poison gas, that sort of thing that can happen in the coal mines and others, too. Now, rounding this out with what's going on with women and industrial society's effect on, how women have to live their lives. Just like kids, most women, especially the urban working class women, they have to work to support their families. Okay, they're the main workers in industries like the textile industry. They're a big part of coal miners before countries like Britain start to outlaw female miners and try to regulate female workers in factories as well. But it's not just that there's a lot of female workers, it's that they're being exploited a little bit more than other factory workers because there's a massive pay gap, right? Female workers get paid something like half as much as men. Later on, up to 2/3 as much as a man doing the same job. And so they're popular with owners just like the kids are because they're cheap. But the negative effect is that you still end up in poverty because you're not making enough money to support yourself with only two parents working. Now, for the middle class and upper class, of course, women don't have to go to work because their husbands make enough money basically where they don't have to. And that's actually a status symbol too, right, with the middle class. If your husband is the breadwinner and can provide for you, then you don't have to go to work. If you were a working woman, then that showed everybody else in your social status that your husband wasn't doing his job, essentially. That's the way they thought of it. And the middle class women, even though they didn't have to go to work, they were still incredibly restricted socially because they had to be a housewife, essentially. And this is all part of what's called the cult of domesticity that develops during the 1800s, where middle class women in general get held to really high standards of morality and etiquette and everything because they're trying to emulate the upper class, and at the same time they're stuck in the house all day because they have to cook, clean, raise the kids, make the house a place that's a safe haven for the man after he's been working all day. And it's the ideology that the woman belongs in the bedroom, in the kitchen, and has to be waiting with a smile and a hot meal when the man gets home from his long day at work. And that was the expectation if you were a middle class woman especially. And we see that cult of domesticity reinforced by the upper class. We see it reinforced by things like advertising during this time, where they have this concept of like the king in the castle, the husband that has the doting wife and kids that are happy to see him when he gets home, with the hot food waiting for him and everything like that. And it gets especially bad because that cult of domesticity and all these ideas that restrict women in their place in society, it bleeds down into the lower classes, where they have a lot of these same expectations for lower class women, except they've been at work for 12 to 16 hours in the factory all day, so they don't have any time to do the cleaning, the cooking, taking care of the kids, because they've been gone trying to be able to afford to do all these other things and pay rent and put food on the table. And they've got all these other, like say, expectations about being pious and submissive to their husbands, and the result of this, though, is that, of course, feminism gains some ground, right? People get really tired of this, and so a lot of women and some men do start to join the feminist movement, the suffrage movement, trying to get rights for women. And it mostly starts at the 1848 Seneca Falls Convention in the U.S. There's several meetings and events in Britain as well. But ultimately, women do start to push back against this cult of domesticity. All right, so real quick, the last thing we need to talk about with this video is going to be the effects on the environment. This one's pretty straightforward and obvious, y'all. They're burning fossil fuels as the main energy source in the Industrial Revolution, right? Coal, then oil, natural gas comes in a little bit later. And that, of course, leads to massive pollution, particularly air and water pollution. So, like, smog becomes something that hits European and American cities. It's a mixture of smoke and fog. The air pollution is so bad that it mixes with the moisture in the air, and it ends up with this haze over the city. If you've ever been somewhere like Los Angeles or Chicago, sometimes you may have seen this, but it gets pretty bad with the water and the air being literally dirty. They've got coal soot and other pollutants that get released constantly. And at least early on, there is absolutely no regulation of people saying, hey, maybe we shouldn't be dumping this in that river. Hey, maybe you should put a filter on your smokestack, right? And this leads to pretty widespread respiratory problems like asthma, emphysema, lung cancer. Water pollution causes other diseases from tainted water. Sometimes it's chemical-caused diseases. Sometimes it's bacterial, like cholera and typhoid. Plenty of other problems from that. And to end the video on a higher note here, the Industrial Revolution's overall legacy, despite all the suffering and issues that we just talked about and we've been talking about in class, ultimately the world does become a better place for people because of the Industrial Revolution, right? Goods are cheaper because of mass production. Goods are more abundant. More people have access to them because of better transportation and everything. The entire world and all these resources and goods are more accessible to more people because of better technology. And the standard of living for everyone, pretty much everywhere in the world, does go up, at least a little bit, because of the Industrial Revolution. And all the other problems with industrialization we've talked about, like extreme poverty, crime, overcrowding, most of those issues will get solved with reform movements, especially in the end of the 1800s, early 1900s. But that's all I got for now. Thank you for sticking with this. We will talk about this more next week.